Alright, start recording. Set up my backup recorder in case anything goes wrong. Alright, awesome. Okay, so tonight we're going to talk about APIs a little bit. So I've taught this now, you guys are the third time I've taught this. First time went okay, some glitches. Second time, lots of glitches, but mostly just code glitches, not so much learning glitches, which is good. So hopefully this one's the charm and you get the best of all of it. We'll see. We'll see how it goes. All right. Just so you know, a couple of housekeeping things. So I have started marking. I just finished off Group 2's Lab 3s. I did go through Lab 2s and Lab 1s that were like sitting there still. I guess some of you had submitted multiple versions. So I cleared those out. I finished all the grades for the quizzes. I also fixed the quiz as well because there was some issues with fill in the blank, and it would actually show you that it was the wrong answer when actually it was true. So I corrected the ones that I could. Any of the ones that were more based on Jessica's opinion on whether or not she considered it to be right or wrong, I directed you to her. So everything seems to be okay. Everything seems to be kind of good. Can I share the link to my GitHub repo? Which GitHub repo? I have hundreds of GitHub repos. Do you just mean GitHub in general? Like my GitHub in general? The last one. That narrows it down. 1 second. I don't remember what I called the last one. I mean, it should already be on Blackboard, shouldn't it? I'm usually pretty good with that. Let me open that in a new tab. Let's see here. So code examples. Yeah, it's right there under code examples. So just go to week 8, right? Go to code examples. GitHub's there. If you go to week 8 and you go to lecture content, the YouTube video is there too. So yeah, just go through there. Yeah, no worries. All right, so where the heck was I? Yeah, so quizzes, right? So I did correct any of the quizzes that were there, so just make sure you review it, make sure I didn't miss anything. But otherwise, they should all be good. I think actually after I corrected it, there was a few that were kind of like a little lower than they should have been, and they all bumped up. So as far as I know, everything worked out, and everybody has their quizzes marked properly. So that also leads us to what's happening tonight. There is no quiz or lab tonight, and the reason why is because the quiz and lab that Jess had actually scheduled for this evening turns out it's for authentication. But we're learning about APIs, which isn't authentication. So I wasn't going to actually give you those, considering those two pieces don't cover what you're learning. However, next week we start authentication, and then the week following I think is also authentication. So you're going to wind up with 2 quizzes and 2 labs, just to give you a heads up. Which is fine because my other group, same thing, they have to do the same thing as well anyway. So it kind of works out for me. But yeah, so that's basically our housekeeping. The other group did ask about the final and what the format was going to be. I have to take a look and see what Jess did for her final. I don't know. Maybe she has like a test, you guys didn't do a midterm, so you wouldn't know, I guess. But she might have a theory test and a practical test. I don't generally do theory tests. I find that they don't do anything. Because at the end of the day, most people just, I don't know. It just doesn't work. It's just based on memory. To me, the best test for knowing whether or not you can practically do something is by doing a practical test. So the test will be a practical test. It's 3 hours long. It's open book, open internet, and open people, meaning you can actually communicate amongst each other. And the reason why I do this is I call it industry testing, which would be like the essential idea that if I was to bring you into my shop and set you down to start work and you didn't know everything, right? Because obviously you're not going to know everything day one, and you needed assistance, that you were capable of asking people for assistance when need be. So that being said, it's not going to be something where you can kind of like copy and paste and share code, because it won't work out that way. Each of your tests will be different. However, you will be able to communicate and ask questions like via Discord or whatever you want to do. No, it won't be a group thing. It'll be individual. But you will be able to reach out via Discord or Slack or whatever and ask people questions. The only limits there are I'm not available for code-based questions. So if it's a code-based question and you're like, how do I connect to MySQL? I'm going to tell you to go look it up. Because that's literally the whole idea. The whole idea is industry. You don't have access to the CTO, which would be me in that scenario, but you have access to each other. So I will recommend that you study. Because I've had students in the past, they're like, oh, my buddy will help me out. Derek knows everything. I'll just rely on Derek. And then it turns out Derek's too busy and he can't help you. And so you wind up still relying on your own knowledge. So definitely study. Okay? That's the big tip I'm going to give you. Cool. Any questions about any of that stuff? Nope. Alrighty then. Okay, so let's talk about APIs. But before we do that, let's just kind of go through these things. So the cool things, just like last week, I'll let you guys go through the cool things and then review them and decide whether or not it's things that you actually... What is this? Okay, so we are given a selection of questions and a basic code and have to do said tasks. No, you're going to get given... Is that proper grammar? I don't think it is. You're going to receive a starter code, right? So everybody gets different starter code. And then in the starter code, there'll be instructions. So you'll wind up with the majority of the code that you need, and either it will contain things that are broken or I will ask you to implement a feature. So, for example, maybe it might be, hey, this code is great, it does CRUD operations, but I need you to add in search. That might be the thing, right? I want to be able to search by these 4 columns or something like that. So it'll be a task, and then you implement that task to the best of your ability. So that is the thing too. I also mark broken code, so if your code doesn't work, I will mark broken code. Just so you know. I know that some professors don't, which I feel like I've never understood that. Like, you guys are learning, so obviously you're going to have mistakes. Plus, when you're under the stress of a test, you will have problems. Like, there will be errors, and you will wind up going down rabbit holes that you shouldn't go down. It just happens. Those are things that happen. So it's always a good idea to, try to make sure it works. But if it doesn't, don't, just, close your laptop, throw it out the window, and give up. Definitely hand it in. All right, week 8 in review. So we talked about form validation, sanitization, normalizing, and validation, right? So we use the filter var for doing a lot of our sanitization, and we sanitize by data type, right? So we sanitize by strings, booleans, integers, whatever the format is, we sanitize it. And we do that because we are protecting ourselves against hackers and idiots. That's what we're protecting ourselves against. We're protecting ourselves from cross-site scripting and SQL injections like a hacker will do, and we're protecting ourselves against data that's in the incorrect format that a person might enter in instead, right? So we're protecting ourselves against those 2 types of people. We normalize our data also to ensure that the data is in the correct format. For example, I think I told you guys the story about my uncle who always writes emails in all capitals. That's the guy I'm protecting against when I do normalization, right? Because I don't want just all capitals inside my database. It's not Henry, it's Henry, right? So I need to, make it look correct. So I do normalization. You have to be a little cautious with normalization, though, because people will get offended if you greatly destroy their name. Like, for example, my name is McKinnon, where I have, got confused there for a second. I have an M, a lowercase c, and a capital K, like that, right? So that is, why does this lately not default to everyone? It's so weird. Anyways, so McKinnon is written like this. So if, based on what we did, it would actually output like this. Some people will get offended by that, right? Some people want the capital letter to be in there. Some people want it that, if they add their umla, it translates, or if they add their apostrophes, it translates, right? Because that's their name. So they want their name to be correct. So you do have to be a little cautious about normalization because you can wind up ruining somebody's formatting, right? So just keep that in mind. Though some places don't care. Like, for example, AWS normalizes your first and last name, and it will change it. It will modify it. So yeah, in week 8, we covered the whole idea of why it's important to validate, sanitize, and normalize. We also took a look at whether or not client-side validation is really a good, a good point of security, right? Does client-side validation provide us any actual security? Hopefully you guys remember this. Yeah, absolutely no. Absolutely no. But what it is good for user experience, right? Provides a better user experience because then we're not doing that round robin thing where the user submits their form, we obsess it and then decide that it's in the incorrect format or they're missing data, so we send it back. And then they fill out the next field and then the same thing. We just keep doing that back and forth, and that's just pointless, right? So this guarantees that the user has at least done their due diligence for the most part. We don't trust it, but at least they've done their due diligence for the most part. They submit it, they get a nice happy user experience. If we happen to find something, we find it and return it. But if our client-side validation is robust enough, ideally, as long as they're filling out the form and they're not intentionally bypassing it, the data we get should be in the correct format. It should already be sanitized and already normalized and ready to go, and we're just plugging it into our database and everybody's happy. So that's the goal, right? We don't care about the user experience of the hacker. The hacker can go dunk his head, but we do care about the experience of the user. So that's going to lead us into, does anybody have any questions about validation, sanitization, or normalization since last week? I guess I should ask. That was quick. No! Harmon says no. Let's just talk about APIs already. All right. The what, how, and why. So what is an API? How is an API? How do you do a how is an API? And why? Why is an API? All right, what is an API? I mean, what does it stand for? Do you guys know what API stands for? What does API stand for? Yep, fairly close. There's one extra letter there that you're kind of leaving out, but yep. Yeah, absolutely. Application, programmable interface, programming interface, program interface. It's one of those three, right? But basically APIs, they, in the simplest of terms, they take complex logic and they wrap it in a simplified function library, right? Or a method library. So they take very complex concepts and they wrap them in something simple. So a good version of an API, and I thought about this, and I wish I had said this in the last class, a good example of an API is IBM Watson, right? So maybe some of you are familiar with Watson. Watson was the one that beat the guy from Jeopardy, that Ken guy. He beat him on Jeopardy. It's an artificial intelligence that you can actually use. So you can actually access Watson, and you can send Watson information and request information from Watson. And the cool thing about it is you don't even need to know how to do machine learning. So you don't need to understand artificial intelligence. You don't need to know how to do machine learning because they provide you with an API. So depending on what it is that you want to do, right? Say it's natural language processing. So say you want to take some literature from somebody and process it and output what the context of that literature is. You can actually use Watson for that purpose. You can use Watson to grab the emotion of some language, right? And it will actually tell you how the language is emoting. There's a whole bunch of things that Watson does. I've only ever touched those two pieces. But then there's also like the Google Cloud API. And same idea. Again, it connects to DeepMind. You're able to actually use machine learning algorithms, but you don't need to understand machine learning algorithms at all. You just simply tap into whatever one of those programming interfaces are that you particularly want to use. For example, Google has a very cool image recognition library that you can plug into, and it will actually tell you what is happening in an image. What artifacts are in that image. So like what products might show up in that image. What are the different things? What are the people's emotions in that image? Stuff like that. So it gives you a lot of information. Sorry about that. People are broadcasting in the house. Let me turn the volume down. Yeah, so it gives you a lot of information, you know, in regards to an image. APIs are super handy because it means you don't have to learn an entire new skill set just to solve one minor problem. The API wraps a complex idea and provides you simple methods to access that information. So there are a bunch of different ways to do this. And I imagine Jess's idea was that we would use some of the embedded APIs that are built into PHP. And we already are. So for example, PDO, it would be considered an API. PDO is a library that wraps the very complex concept of being able to connect to a database and interface with that database and send requests and retrieve requests and so on and so forth. PDO wraps that so you don't need to understand the science behind that. All you need to know how to do is connect and send a query, right? So that's the cool thing about PDO. PDO is an API. PHP also has a library called the GD library, which allows you to be able to manipulate images without really needing to understand the underlying library, which is ImageMagick. So ImageMagick is super complex. You can do a lot of really cool things, including bit depth, and you can do pixel densities and stuff like that, and you can get really intrinsic on what you want to actually do with it. However, GD makes it much easier to use because then you can just perform whatever things you want to do without really needing to understand ImageMagick. And then you can even go up a level further than that because GD has actually been aliased quite heavily in PHP, just providing little functions for things, right? So if you want to convert a JPEG to a PNG, you can do it with just a simple function call. You don't need to instantiate GD and go down that route. You can actually just call simple function calls, provided the arguments that you need, and do image conversions or new resolutions or scale or rotate or whatever it is that you need to do. So API is super handy. I was talking to Yulia in the other class, and Yulia was saying to me, you know, after the whole lesson, she said, you know, why? Why do we use these APIs? What is the purpose for them, right? Like, why do I need to know this? Where is it going to come up? So I'll explain to you a little bit what I used to do. So I worked at Mintent, and we were building a large-scale application for doing content analysis. Essentially what happens is somebody gives us a blog post. We take that blog post, and using different types of algorithms, machine learning algorithms, we can tell you what the emotion behind your blog post is, what your keywords were, like so the keywords that are actually presented in the blog post. We can tell you what the pivotal content is, so like which part of the blog post actually is the most impactful. We can tell you, you know, your spelling and stuff like that, make sure it's all correct, your grammar, whether or not your grammar is correct. We can provide a ton of information about your blog post, right? And we do that by using different machine learning algorithms plus different like little, you know, just common algorithms that we've built. However, because so many people will be accessing this platform, we needed to build it in a way that it wasn't client specific, right? We weren't guaranteeing that it had to be run from a browser. We weren't guaranteeing that it had to run from our website even. What we wanted to do was allow anyone to consume this data by just simply accessing it. So the way we do that is we created an API, and we give people tokens, right? And then they use that token so that they can access that API. They build their own client. They build their own website that accesses that data, and then they do whatever they're going to do with that data after that point. So we could have 2,000 people all accessing the data with 2,000 different websites because we have an API. APIs allow us to have the versatility of creating any client to consume that data, right? But the cool thing about the API is we control. We get to control everything about it. So we can wrap super complex methods in simple interfaces so that people can access that data quite simply. Or we can wrap very concrete security around our database and then provide simple endpoints for people to be able to access that data without ever actually needing to deal with the security themselves. So APIs are super important. They power the internet. Arguably, they always will. I'm not saying that every website you ever encounter is going to require an API, but you are likely in some point in your career will need to use an API of some sort, whether it's adding a Google map to a website, adding reCAPTCHA to a website, or even going as far as integrating IBM Watson or Google's DeepMind, right? So, what is an API? Something that is made available in programming languages that help developers create complex functionality simply, right? More easily. So it wraps complex functionality in simple methods or functions. A way to abstract more complex code and provide easier code. So that's exactly it. The two things kind of say the same thing. It's wrapping a complex idea and giving you a way to access that complex idea in a simple method, right? In a simple pattern. So how do APIs work? They're based on objects. That's not entirely true. They're not necessarily based on objects. They are a feature set, right? So it will be functions and methods. They're a feature set that you can access and utilize in order to work with that API. Have recognizable entry points. That's 100% true. A lot of the time, APIs follow certain paradigms, right? So for example, the API we're going to build tonight is based on the REST paradigm, which means that we're using HTTP methods. So hopefully you know what those are. HTTP methods, get and post, in order to tell the API what kind of operations we're attempting to do, right? So recognizable entry points also could consider simple naming conventions, that the API abides by simple naming conventions, such as plurals and singular methods and stuff like that that represent what you're trying to retrieve. It uses a lot of grammatical syntax in order to get what you want, right? So for example, say I wanted all the users. I could call my API point /API/users, and the API is like, oh, you're looking for users, so it returns back all the users. But if I was to write /API user, then it would say, oh, you want one user. Who do you want? And then I can give it some information, and it provides me back the information or the response that I need. Events to handle changes in state. This is definitely true if you're using things like JavaScript, where there's an event handler there. I haven't generally used event systems in non-JavaScript ways, though I imagine you definitely could. And additional security, yeah, absolutely. It allows you to wrap your whole, like for example, the database, right? So we do all that connection with the database, we validate, we sanitize, we normalize. That's our added security, right? Whereas somebody using our REST API, they don't see any of that. They're not dealing with the validations, they're not dealing with any of that. We've wrapped that logic. All they're doing is hitting that endpoint, and then we return whatever data it is they need. We've taken care of all the security side of it. So tonight we're going to look at building a simple API. We're not going to add Google reCAPTCHA just because there's a lot more things you have to do in order to do it. We would all have to have Gmail accounts. You'd have to register an application with them. You can only run it locally, and then you would have to add in a new URL to get it to work remotely. So it's quite a bit of stuff in order to make that work. So we're going to avoid that process for tonight. However, we are going to go to our module 4 and to week 9. And we're going to go to code examples. And we're going to pull down our starter files. Once you have the starter files, go ahead and click Show in Folder. And I'm going to click on Extract All. And then I'm going to browse. So I'm going to go to my www folder. I'm going to click on my comp-1006 folder. And I'm going to create a new file folder in here called lesson-09. And I'm going to select that folder. And then I'm going to extract into that folder directly. So there we go. Now, if you look in lesson 9, you're going to have this subfolder called API Example Student. If you double click on it, there's 2 folders in there. I'm just going to drag them into just the lesson 9 folder. That way they're not recessed into another folder, right? So I have API and API Example Student and Client. And I'm going to delete the API example student folder because there's no reason to keep it around. So all I'm left with is API and API client in my lesson 9 folder in my www directory. Hopefully that type of stuff doesn't trip you up. Then I'm going to right click and choose to open with code. I'm going to dock that to my left, dock my browser to my left, dock my IDE to the right. And then I'm going to navigate to that folder. So localhost comp-1006 Wednesday 03 for you guys. And then my lesson 9 folder. Alright, so what I would like you to do first is I would like you to click on the API so that we're navigating to that directory. Let me move. Yeah, so you're going to click on API and your URL at the top is going to change. I'd like you to click up there and copy that URL. Okay? And the reason I want you to do that is because in the client folder, in the index.php page, there is a small error in there. This base endpoint at the top is my API for my lesson plans. We need to replace that line with that API you just copied. And this is super important. See this trailing slash at the end of it? Get rid of it. So it should just say http:// whatever your address is, lesson 9/API. No additional slash. Okay? And that's under the client index.php file. Once you've done that, you can click your back button and then click on client. And if you did that correctly, you should only have 2 errors on the page. You should have this big orange error here, and then a little orange error down by the table. Yeah. Okay, cool. So tonight we are going to build a very simple REST API. Our REST API is going to use the contacts table that we created last week, and essentially we're going to build endpoints for us to be able to reach it. So let me show you kind of what that's going to look like. So we want to be able to access all of the contacts. And generally the way we do that is we just simply access /API/contacts in the world of APIs. So this is the general format for accessing an API endpoint. This endpoint, if we were to use the API method get, will return all contacts for us. Okay? If I wanted to return just one contact, I would do get/API/contacts/show. So that's the action I want to do. And then the ID for that particular contact. If I wanted to create a contact, it's a little bit different. I need to send a post request, which I can do quite easily from an HTML form. Again, it's going to point to API contacts/. However, it's going to create a new contact. And the reason that my application will know this is different is based on the HTTP method. That's why these two things, so this thing here and this thing here, are different, even though it looks like the same path. they will functionally work different because of the HTTP method used. And then I also have update and delete, which will follow this same pattern, essentially. We'll post to those. I'll just write one of them for now. Update. We'll update existing contact. And you may be like, well, where's the ID for this one? We don't need it because it will be a part of the form. So there's a few different ways to actually make this functionality work. Now, I know up to this point you guys have created websites and web pages, and I'm assuming you understand how the idea of when we go to client, what the default page is that renders. What is the default page that renders when I'm going to client slash? Or when I go to any directory and slash? What is the default PHP script that renders? Or maybe you guys never learned this. Yeah, index.php. So index, no matter what, even if it's not a PHP page, even if it's just HTML, it is the default page that renders, right? So if we wanted to create, say, API contacts, we could create a /API/contacts/index.php to get that look. But if we wanted to create one for show, that's going to look a little different, isn't it? To do that one, we would have to do /API/contacts/show/index.php, give it a query string, right? And then whatever the ID is going to be. That's not very clean looking, and that is actually very off-putting to people using your API. They don't want to go to that. What they would much rather do is type in this path and still access the same information, right? That works if we were to go to here, but it doesn't work if we go to here, because how do we pass this ID? We can't create a directory for every single contact that we have, right? Like, we can't be like, okay, well, that's cool, you want that, so we'll do contact/show/ okay, you have one, cool, we'll do index.php, and then we'll do 2 for the second person inside your database, and then we'll do 3 for the third person inside your database. This is very poor design, right? We can't wind up with, say we had 10,000 records, we can't have 10,000 folders. That's terrible. So there has to be a better idea. How can we get it so that we can have this format without doing this kind of structure, right? Just so we can have that nice, pretty URL path. Well, that's where something called an Htaccess file comes in. What an Htaccess file allows us to do is override how the Apache server responds to requests. It actually interprets the request and performs some operations on it before we actually get the request within our code. So let's take a look at how we can actually manipulate that. So in your directories here, under API, you're going to have a file in there called .htaccess. Go ahead and open that up. So let's take a look at what currently happens in our system. So I'm going to replace /client here with /API. So I go to the API directory. And right now, this page is loading. And like Andrew said, this is loading the index.php page for us. Right? That's the default page that's currently loading. So if I go to /contacts, you would assume it would load the contacts index.php. But I don't have a contacts.php page or index.php. What I have is a controller.php page. But that's not what I want, right? Like, I can go to controller.php, but there's nothing there, and the URL, the URL looks like this, right? It doesn't look like what we want. We don't want this. We want it to go to contacts, but there's no index page there. So what we can do is we can tell the Htaccess file that it routes all traffic that goes in the URL to /API, route all that traffic to index.php. So no matter what gets passed, it will be routed to index.php for us. So here's how we fix that. In our Htaccess file, we're going to add some rules. the first thing we want to do is double check that we have a module as a part of our Apache server. So I'm going to do if module mod rewrite .c, and then we're going to close it just like you would an HTML tag. This is known as XML, by the way. What this is going to do is it's going to tell the Apache server, see if we have this mod rewrite module, because we need that in order to perform the operations we want to perform. If they don't exist, then this isn't going to work. So now, just so you know, Scott and Jesse, who both are running their own types of servers, had to actually, I think Scott had to install the mod rewrite for it to work. So if you're rolling your own server and you're not using WAMP, MAMP, or XAMPP, you're going to have some issues with this and you'll need to resolve it. Once we have this tag, we'll call it a tag, right? Once we have these tags, we can go ahead and write our rule set. So the first thing we want to do is turn on the rewrite engine. So we set it to on. What the rewrite engine is responsible for is for making sure that this URL does not change or it modifies it appropriately. It's responsible for doing that based on any rules that we tell it to. Next, we want to give it a rewrite rule. So the rewrite rule, we're only going to have one. Rewrite rule. The rewrite rule allows us to take whatever path the user has or whatever file the user has requested, take their request, and then treat it in a different way. So it's going to actually pass this URL. So the URL you see up here is what it's going to pass. It's going to pass that, and we can actually analyze this in order to understand what it's doing. The easiest way to analyze it is just to provide a catch-all regular expression. So this regular expression will catch literally anything that gets typed up here in the address bar. And then we want to funnel that request. So no matter what the request is that gets called up here, we're going to funnel them all to our index.php page. And we're not going to do any redirects. So this little rule set here, it's just how it's supposed to handle it, right? So we don't want to redirect to the page. We just want to funnel all traffic to that page without redirecting. So that's essentially what that means. So checking if the module exists, turning our rewrite engine on, and routing all of our traffic to our local index.php page under the API. So if I refresh, you're not going to see any change here, right? But where you will see a change is if we try to access a file that doesn't exist. So I don't exist.php. Notice I don't get a 404 page. You can add comments by using these hashtags. So just precursor your line with a hashtag, and that will actually comment the file for you. So the reason why we want this is because we want the user to be able to go to contacts/show/123, for example. So this URL pattern, I'll paste this. It won't work for you unless you have the same URL, but that URL pattern, we want to be able to navigate there and not have it blow up, right? Nor have all these nested directories with index files, because that's ludicrous. So we want it to go to there, and then we can start processing that path to figure out what the user is looking for. And that brings us to our index.php page. So let's go ahead and open up the API index.php page. So every single request that we get, we need to respond to. In some way or another, we need to respond to it and give back some sort of information. The easiest way to respond to these requests is by creating a function that allows us to create a simplified response. So we're going to do that first. We're going to create a function right here under step 1. We're going to call it response, and it's going to have 2 parameters, code and message. And then our first piece that we're going to do is build the response status code. So when we respond with something, generally the status code is 200 unless something has gone wrong. If something has gone wrong, it could be a 400 series error, say it's something to do with our database or a file is missing or it's a forbidden access file or something like that. Or a very, very cataclysmic problem like a 500 error, which basically means the server has failed. Something on the server has gone wrong, right? Generally, you will send the 400 errors. 500 errors means it's usually something you haven't caught and something has gone wrong. So we're going to pass the code here. So this code will be whatever we send it, right? So it'll be a 404, a 200, 500, whatever it is. We'll tell it what the code is. But it will be a number. The next thing we're going to run is header. And you guys have used header before to reset your location, right? To redirect from a spot that you are to another spot. And you've used header in order to do that, which is cool. But header actually does way more than that. The purpose of header is to set the headers for your response. And you can set as many headers as you require. You could set cookies, you could set sessions, you could set whatever you want in the header code. So we are going to set our content type. And we're doing this because we want to essentially force our content type to be application JSON. This tells the browser or whatever the client is how to process this particular response. So we're going to return with JSON. And what JSON is, I imagine you guys don't have tons of experience with it, but what JSON is it's the universal language between programs. That's the easiest way to describe it. It allows us to take a program that's written in PHP and allow it to communicate with a program written in JavaScript. Or take a program written in Ruby and allow it to communicate with a program written in C#. The reason is because the message that we send back in JSON is actually a language that every programming language, at least everyone that I've ever encountered out of like 10 programming languages, can comprehend. They usually have a built-in library for parsing JSON, and then they can understand what the response is. You can't send functions through JSON, but you can send almost every type of data, right? So you can send booleans, arrays, objects, strings, numbers. All of that is definitely transmittable, but you can't send classes, functions, methods, nothing interactable. And then we need to respond, and the way we respond from PHP is by actually literally echoing. So we're going to say echo, and then we're going to encode a JSON response. So whatever message they give us, we're going to turn into a JSON response. And that's our complete response function. So once again, it's just a simple function to respond with the correct headers, so our correct status code, our correct content type, and then as a JSON response. That's all it's doing for us. It's just completing that. And if you hit refresh, you won't have any errors or anything because this is just a function and we haven't even executed it yet. Cool. So this path that we have that I originally shared with you guys, this path that I've created, actually can be broken down into different pieces. Very, very important pieces. So let's take a look at this path and see what we're looking at here. So I'm going to widen my screen a little bit, and we'll describe each of the pieces here. So the first little bit, this piece right here that you see, is actually known as a schema. Okay? This protocol tells the browser how to make this request, what protocol to use in order to make that request. HTTP means insecure, right? It's an insecure protocol. It's going to use the hypertransfer. I'm saying that wrong. I forget what it stands for now. It's hypertransfer something protocol. I can't remember what it is now off the top of my head. But anyways, it's an insecure protocol. Text transfer, that's what it is. Hypertext transfer protocol. And then there's also HTTPS, which is hypertext transfer protocol with secure, right? Security. So it's like an SSL certificate that basically ensures encryption between point A and point B, between the requester and the responder. So that's the schema portion. The next piece that you're looking at is your domain, right? Which usually ends with like .com or something like that. And then the next portion is your path. So this path part here that you see here, super important, right? However, we're going to break this path into different pieces. So we're going to have a root portion to our path. The root portion stops where our API stops. Then the next piece of our path is our resource. So this is the thing that we want to access that has some sort of data correlation, right? So in our scenario, our contacts are in our database, but we are also going to use an external API, the Chuck Norris API. So our data source will be our API. Then we have an action, right? So the action is the thing that you want to execute. So resource is the data we want to perform our action on, okay? And then the last part is params, and it doesn't matter how many of them there are. You can have multiple slashes, but they are all parameters. So this is essentially what we want to create. I'll give you this just for any whatchamacallit, for your own notes if you want it. But this is essentially what we want to create. We want to break our path down. We essentially want to strip this out, get rid of this altogether. We only care about the resource, the action, and the params. That's all we care about. So we want to create those three pieces. So the way to create those three pieces is going to require us to actually break that string apart. We're going to have to break it into separate little parts. Oh, I almost forgot. The connect.php, we should fix this. If you go to connect.php, make sure you're connecting to the correct database, and make sure you're using your username and root password, right? Make sure those are all set up, ready to go. Okay? Also notice that I've wrapped our database in a function call. So we can use the function call in order to access it. That's everything that covers that. Just make sure your data credentials are correct. Alright, so a RESTful API requires us to be able to understand the request path provided, as it will determine the key parts, resource, action, params, to build the proper response. So that's what we want to do. We want to be able to build that proper response. So one of the things that we're going to utilize in order to do that, which is super cool, is it's called, hold on, brain stopped working for a second. It's called a super global associative array, and you guys have seen these before with posts. So $_post is a global associative array, and so is $_get. These are arrays created by PHP during the instantiation of your application. It also creates one called server. The cool thing about server, and I'll show you this here. The cool thing about server is server contains a bunch of information in regards to who is actually making the request and about your personal server itself. So I have my host, right? So the host is the address that points to this, so that's localhost. I have cache control information. I have the browser that's being used. I have the user agent from the requester, which you could actually look at and determine what their browser is. So this says Chrome version 89, so I could use that to be able to deliver specific type logic for their browser. Really not a big deal. Sometimes can be a big deal if you start having to perform different operations for Explorer. A bunch of fetch information, We have our system root. We have the actual like path locations of where this file is executing from. Lots of different pieces of information. The ones I care about are the request URI at the very bottom here and the PHP self. And the reason why I care about those is because this is the URL that the person has requested here, right? So this is our URL that they're looking for. They're looking for comp 1006 Wednesday 03 less than 9 API contact show 123. We know that we only care about this little chunk. So we kind of want to get rid of this chunk, right? The chunk before it. So the easiest way to do that is to create an intersection. And we can do that using PHP self, because if you look at PHP self, it basically matches up, right? Or you could use script name, that also works. But PHP self is very reliable, and so is request URI. So we're going to use those two pieces. However, you'll notice we have this extra little straggler here, index.php. We need to somehow get rid of that. So here's how we're going to build it. First, we're going to create a variable called resolved path. Then we're going to use something called string replace. String replace takes 3 arguments. It takes a needle, it takes the thing you want to replace, and it takes a haystack. The needle is the thing you're searching for, right? You're searching for this pattern. And the haystack is the place you're actually searching for it. The thing in the middle will be the thing that you're going to replace it with. So like I said, I want to get rid of this index.php, and the easiest way to do that is by using the function dir name, which will only return back the directory before the file name. So the whole directory path, actually. And then we will give it the argument of server php underscore self. So that's what we're going to give it. Then we're going to tell it, because that will be the needle, we're going to tell it to replace it with an empty string. And then in the haystack will be the request URI, because that's the thing the user has sent us. And then because we're all likely curious what that's going to look like, let's do a var dump of $resolved path. That way we can easily tell what that is actually going to look like. Alright, so let's take a look at what this is going to look like. We'll refresh it. And sure enough, you can see that the only pieces of information from that URL we are getting are just the little pieces at the end, right? Just our little chunks. Contacts, show, and 123. That's the only little pieces we're getting. So that's cool. So we have the first little piece of it. We have the resolved path. So let's see if you guys have been following along. Which part of this path is our resource? So if you were to map our resource to this, which part of this path would be the resource? Yeah, absolutely. It'd be the contacts. Which part of the path would be the params, or the parameters? Yep. And that obviously leaves show. What would show be? What is show? Exactly, it's our action. There you go. Look at you guys doing rest like pros. So contacts is our resource, show is our action, and 1, 2, 3, and anything after that is our parameters. All right. There's a bit of a logic problem coming up that I'm going to see if you guys can solve better than the last class did. We'll see. So now we're going to create something called parts, right? So the parts are the various pieces of our requested path. Really what it is it's us taking this path and breaking it into its individual pieces, okay? We're going to wind up with 4 pieces here. We're going to have a root, which represents this first slash you see here. Then we'll have our resource, which represents contacts. We'll have our action, which represents show. and then our params, which will represent 1, 2, 3. If I want to take a string and I want to break it into individual items into an array, so take a string and convert it to an array, what is the PHP command that I use to do that? So what is the PHP command to take a string and convert it into an array? I'll give you a hint. It starts with an E. Yeah, absolutely. It's explode. So we use explode, and we give explode a delimiter, right? So the delimiter we're going to give it is the slash here, right? Now, if you're on a Mac, it may have to point the other way, but I don't think so. Nobody's complained so far. And then we give it the array, or sorry, the string that we want to explode, which will be resolved path. And then we'll var dump that so you can see what happens. So as you can see, it's broken into these 4 pieces. We have the root, we have our resource, we have our action, and we have our parameters. I'm going to get rid of these var dumps as we go along, because if we keep them around, we will wind up with some issues in the end, because they'll output and they'll technically count as a response. So I'm going to sign those off. So parts index 0 will be the root. Resource will be parts index 1, right? Action will be parts index 2, but action could be empty, just to let you know, because if we were to get rid of show and just do contacts, we will only get contacts. There will be no show. It will be empty string. And this entire array item will be missing altogether. So what we're going to do is basically check. We're going to say, hey, do you actually have a parts 2? Because if you don't, just set it as null. These double question marks act like an or. So if this or this, then set it as null. If this is true, just return this. So if that's true, it'll return that. If it's false, then it will return this. Kind of a handy little feature set. Then the next one we want to do is set our params, but our params are literally anything that this ends with, right? So if it has, Gerard at the end of it, we want to make sure that we're constantly getting all of these parameters that get added, because who knows what we're using them for, right? We want to get every single one that they add. So this will be an is set, $parts 3, question mark. So this is basically checking to see if parts 3 is set. If it's not, we're going to use a ternary. And if it's true, we'll slice it. So slice takes 3 arguments. It takes the array you want to slice, the index you want to start at, and the number of elements you want to cut. So we want to cut off basically the remainder of the array. Otherwise, we're going to return a default empty array. So these are all of our parts. Let's var dump those and just make sure everything looks right. So $root, $resource, $action, $params, right? And I'll give you those. If we refresh, sure enough, there's our root, there's our resource, there's our action, and here's our parameters that we're rendering, right? If we back all that out so we only have contacts and hit enter, we get the contacts, but now there's no action, and the parameters is empty, which is what we want. We want that to equal that. Let's go back to show 1, 2, 3. The next piece we need to capture is the actual request method itself. So if we come down here to step 4, we're going to store the request method. And the reason is because we're going to use the request method to determine if the user is requesting the correct action under the correct request method. Because if they're not, we're going to reject it. If you var dump the request method, it will return either get or post. Nope, not that. Request method. Refresh here, and sure enough I get because that's the type of method we're requesting. So there are quite a few request methods available. However, the only one we're concerning ourselves with are get and post. However, there are a few others. The ones that are most commonly used are put, patch, delete, and head. Those are the other ones. However, most browsers don't support it. Most browsers only support get and post and won't support the other HTTP methods for sending. So if you want to send with those methods, you have to use something like Ajax in order to send for them properly. Servers can definitely interpret them, but browsers have difficulty actually transporting them. So you can create a form, but you can't put method delete on the form. It won't work. It just doesn't understand. All right. You're going to be like, you're a broken record, Sean. Resource. What is the value of resource right now? I don't know. You shouldn't be getting URL not found. Was your Htaccess file working before, Andrew? Yeah, Nick, contacts is correct. Oh no. Are you using WAMP, MAMP, or XAMP, or are you rolling your own? It definitely should work. Maybe copy my rewrite rule here and use it just to be sure. The character case can cause an issue. In what, Harmon? Where are you calling that and getting that? Where is that outputting? Oh, you only get this particular portion of it? You don't get this part of it, is what you're saying? In your index file, did you create this string? And then you var dump $request underscore method, like so. You used var dump, right? Yeah, you need to var dump it. It doesn't really matter though, because we're not going to be var dumping. Yeah, no worries, Andrew. Yeah, okay, Herman. No worries. It doesn't matter anyways. Erase that var dump because we can't have them all over the place. We're only using it just to run tests. All right, let's see if you guys can get this logic, because the other class didn't get the logic as we went through it very slowly. All right, let's see if you guys can get this logic. Okay. Here's my task. I want to access either the contacts controller or the Htaccess controller. I don't know which because the URL is going to declare that for me. Okay? So the user is going to pass a URL, and I'm going to load in either the Htaccess controller or the contacts controller dynamically. So the first little piece that I want to write is if they've actually created a resource, I want to render the resource. Otherwise, we'll perform some sort of action here. Okay? How can I load in the content of one of these two controllers? Let's start with the basics. How do I take the contents of a file and put it into this file? What do I use to do that? What is the PHP command? There's so many of them. Yeah, include is one of them. We can use it. I kind of like require once. It's one of my favorites. Okay, so require. Now, how can I dynamically choose which one of these controllers I'm going to load? And I want you to think about this for a second. What's the value of resource, right? I think Nay said it's contacts. If I change this to Htaccess, the value of resource is now what? It's Htaccess, right? Yeah, we can use the string to add it to the path. Okay, so I've got a string here. And I definitely don't want to do this, right? Because that pigeonholes it into contact/controller.php. I want to be able to dynamically choose which one of those two I'm accessing. So can anybody tell me what my syntax would look like? Yes, absolutely, Andrew. That is absolutely correct. We use the word resource because if you look at our folders, it is not by accident that the resources we're accessing are spelled exactly the same way that the folders are, right? They are one-to-one, and they are one-to-one intentionally. Naming convention when you're building an API is super important. This concept for building a routing system like this is actually very common. This happens all the time, right? So, essentially what is happening now is we are requiring once. This is going to replace itself with whatever URL we're putting in here, right? Whatever particular resource we've chosen will replace this spot, and then we will load the controller for that particular resource. Smart, eh? All right. You guys did it. The other class didn't do it. You guys did it, though. Awesome. You have bragging rights now. Let's add in our switch. So the purpose of our switch is to actually go through, check the action, make sure it exists, and then render the appropriate response if it's wrong. Okay? We have one thing to fix, though. Up here where it says null, let's change that so it says index. Okay? So if there isn't anything, by default, it will be index. So on line 35, we're just changing that action line so that it defaults to index instead of null. I meant to do that, but I forgot. It's kind of different in my notes, but still. And I'll show you why. So here's our switch statement that we're going to create. Switch $action. So we're going to take a look at action, and we're going to execute the following cases. Case 1. Does action equal show? No? Okay, that's okay. Case 2. Does action equal search? No? Okay, that's fine. Case 3. Does action equal index? If it equals one of those three, then execute the code between this case and break. So I'm not sure if you knew that cases could work like this, but you can basically treat these like OR. Does case equal show, or search, or index? If it does, execute the code right directly after that. We're going to do it again. Does case equal create? Or does case equal update? Or does case equal delete? Does it equal one of those three things? Break. So we're not even going to have a default statement because we don't need one. It can only be one of these sets. It cannot actually be default. So if that happens, actually, arguably we will never, oh yeah, we will. Yeah, never mind. We are going to actually output a response. So if, we're going to check our request method. If the request method does not equal the request we're expecting for these three, then we're going to execute some code. What request method do you think that these three should use? So I'll help you out. Get is used for requesting data, but not manipulating it. Post is used for manipulating data. So which request method? Yeah, absolutely. We're going to use get here. Which means this same response kind of comes down here, only this one is for post, right? Now the actual filling this out is kind of the same, but we'll do it in separates anyways. Here we go. We're going to return our response function. Remember that wonderful thing? We're going to do a 404 error code, and then we're going to give a message. This message might look a little weird because it's an associative array. And we're passing associative array because we want to make sure that this gets converted into JSON, and unfortunately it either has to be an associative array or an object for it to be converted. And then we can literally apply the same response down here because it is identical. So if these things do not match their request method that's associated with them, then we will respond with a 404. That's how these will work. So what happens in the scenario that it's an action that doesn't exist? That's when we need a default. And the default action, if it doesn't exist, will be just responding with a 404 because that action does not exist. So we can't respond with it. So this is a little bit constrained, which is kind of unfortunate. Because it won't support any other action types but those ones. However, when you guys take the JavaScript Frameworks class, you will learn about being able to do this in a much better way. We're just trying to do this in the simplest way possible. So if you wanted to add the ability to handle more action types, you would have to add them to this. And that's also kind of bad anyways because, for example, search. I mean, Chuckisms, the controller that we're going to create, won't use search, won't use show, won't use create, won't use update or delete. It will only use index, which means none of this needs to load for it. So there is that little bit of inefficiency. So that's cool, but what does all this absolutely mean? Well, don't forget we need to add that, oh, not that whole thing. There we go. We only need one of these. Grab that little block of if statement there, and we'll paste it into our else statement here as well. So we won't actually do the request like that, though. We only need the response part of it. Just this little chunk. That's all we need. Okay? So if there's a resource, we'll fire it through the switch action, and if everything is good, then we'll execute whatever. Otherwise, we'll just respond with a 404. So at the bottom of our switch statement, down here is the last command we need to call. We are going to return a call user func array, which takes two arguments. Here's what I want you to think about. We are loading our controller dynamically, right? The reason we're loading the controller dynamically is because we don't want to have to explicitly define which controller we're going to load. We want to be able to use the path and use the resource that they provided in order to load the correct controller. Okay? Hopefully you guys understand that concept. Action. How does action come into play? Action is the function that we want to call in that controller. So in these controllers, we're going to define a bunch of functions. PHP is going to look at our resource. It's going to load that controller. All those functions are going to get loaded. And then we want to call that function dynamically. You can't, in PHP, call index, for example, with a set of parentheses. That's not a thing in PHP. You can't do that, right? In fact, that's not a thing in most languages, right? So how do we call a function based on a string? Because the value of action is a string. That's where this function comes into play. Call user func array. We give it a string, so our action, and then we give it whatever parameters we want to execute. So that's where params comes into play. And what will happen is when we execute this, it will read the action that we have. It will pass it to this call user func, just as a string, just the equivalence as if you passed index directly, like this, right? As long as that function exists, it will execute it and pass our params to it. Even if they're empty, it'll still pass it to it. So if I hit refresh, it's going to break, but look why it's breaking. Expects parameter 1 to be a valid callback function called show, not found or invalid function name, meaning that it's looking for the function called show, which is what our current actions value is, but it can't find it. It doesn't know where it is. Okay? So let's do chuckisms and then we'll take a break. So what I would like you to do is delete everything after API and replace it with the word chuckisms. So you're going to notice that we're going to get a weird error message. And the reason why we're getting this weird looking error message is because we're returning JSON as a response. So really just pay attention to the top part here where it says status not found. The rest is a big error telling us what went wrong. So let's fix it so that we don't get that error. So what we need to do is we need to load the chuckisms controller. And we need to provide it an index function. So we're going to create a function in here called index. Just like that. Super simple. The chuckisms index function is actually going to reach out to an external, brain stop working, external API called the Chuck Norris API. So I'll copy the link for you. This is the API endpoint that we're going to access. So the first thing we want to do is reach out and store that value into a variable. So the way we actually access an endpoint in PHP is by using the function file get contents, which will allow us to make an external request. Then we paste that URL I gave you into it, and that will actually create the external request and then store it into our response. Then to return it, we just return the response. We provide a 200, and we need to decode the response because we're encoding it in our response function. So we need to decode it first. So we do JSON decode $response because it comes back as JSON as well. So we need to decode it first. And if that's working and we hit refresh, we should get our chuckisms. I'm getting a 404. Not sure why I'm getting a 404, but we're getting a 404. Sometimes you can use your network tab to tell why. Let's see the preview. See, because it's returning like this, it's super frustrating. I bet you I have an error, and I just can't tell what the error is. So if you're getting an error, the easiest way to tell is by opening up the index.php page. And up here where we're passing the data type, the header for the JSON, we can comment it out, and then we'll get proper things. So the problem that I'm getting right now is that the user func array expects parameter 1 to be a valid callback function. However, it got an empty string. So that's not good. So I have a funny feeling that is due to this argument right here. So it's looking for actions parts 2. Oh, right, that makes sense. Because this is probably an empty array. And that question mark thing only works if it's actually null, false, or what is it? Null, false, or 0 or something like that. So instead, we'll check to see if it's empty. And if it's empty, we'll return index. Otherwise, we'll return parts 2. So I'll copy that and give that to you guys, and you can correct that line once again. And then if I refresh, that should fix that, which it looks like it's doing. Yep, and then we get our Chuck Norris API response. So once you fix that, I'm going to re-enable our JSON header so that we can see this in JSON. So there it goes. It's a nice JSON format. Wow, some of these are offensive. I didn't realize some of these were this bad. I think I need to choose a different API. I used to use the Matt Bass insult API. I love that thing. That thing was awesome. Yeah, I didn't think it was that bad. The Matt Bass insult API is pretty funny. It literally takes a noun and a verb and then puts a bunch of stuff together and then writes this insult, right? And it calls you a whole bunch of names. But then I had a student that was like, I don't really like using that. Can we use something different? And they recommended the Chuck Norris API, and I was using it for a while. But it seems like they've added a whole bunch of new ones to it that are not good. Like as of the 1st of 2020, right? Ugh. Oh well. We're just using it as an external. We'll replace it at some point. Okay, so that controller is all set up. Now, interestingly enough, if you duplicate this slide, or this tab, and change from API to client, like so, that first error should go away, and you now get a Chuck Norris random quote instead. Some of these also don't make any sense. Like, that's not even funny. It's not even amusing. It's just dumb. Alright, let's take a break. Let's take 10 minutes because we really don't have much left to get through. And we can just kind of end early. Alright? So why don't we go to 8:35 and then meet back here and then we'll resume. There we go. Okay, so where we left off, we have our index page. It's all completed. And we're now routing to our controller actions. So we have the Chuck Norris API working, and it's actually producing something to our client. Even if it's not working in your client, that's fine. As long as it's working in the API, then we're good to go. Okay? So our next step is to actually hook up our contacts controller, which is a little bit more robust compared to our Chuckisms controller, right? The Chuckism controller is very simple. All it does is output a Chuck Norris quote. That's it. All right, so let's open up our contacts controller.php page. So this is our contacts controller. The purpose of the controller is to build a response to the user's request. This involves gathering the necessary data, building it into a client-side friendly response, like in JSON, and then responding. It also handles any of the errors that might happen to occur. So our actual like contacts API controller is going to be fairly simple. I've already created the create, update, and delete methods for you, and the reason I did that is because they're very similar to what we did last week anyways, so it doesn't really matter. I cannot get this type of output in Chuckisms. If you spell Chuckisms wrong, that's going to be a big problem. Because it does look at it one-to-one, so it has to be spelt correctly. So make sure that you're actually accessing the correct endpoint, Harmon. Because if you're... What's the error you get? Yeah, I guess so. 1 second. Okay, hold on 1 second right there. Go back to where you were. Go back to your IDE for a second. Harmon, can you go back to VS Code? See that second line that you have there? You have line 6 and 7 and they're duplicated. Remove one of those two. What happened? Yeah, remove one of those lines. Because you don't need both those lines. I'm not sure why you have to. Not both of them, just one of them. You need to keep one around. They're doing the same thing, right? And only the first one's going to execute. The second one won't execute. And then the other issue I saw, if you go back to your browser for a second, the error message is telling you what's wrong. So it says, require once Chuckisms contacts controller.php. The reason why that says Chuckisms controller or contacts controller is likely in your index.php on line 52. So if you go to API index.php line 52, yep. Yeah, you wrote the word contacts there. Get rid of that word contacts. There you go. Save that. And then go back to the browser and refresh it. Nope. Put that slash back in. Yep. There you go. Go ahead and refresh. There you go. You just need to add the Chuckisms back in. Yep. There you go. There. It's working. Yeah, there is quite a big lag between... It just depends on internet speeds, right? I think my internet's been pretty shaky and other people's internet can be shaky, so it causes that issue. Alright, stop sharing your screen. Yeah, no problem. Okay, I will share my screen again, and we will finish this off. Alright, this is going to go pretty quick. It went pretty quick in the other class. It was only about 20 minutes, and then we were done. I'll reopen the chat so I can tell when you people are asking me questions. There we go. Okay, so we're going to create an index action here. Now, right now, our URL is pointing to Chuckisms. Let's take off Chuckisms and just point it to contacts for now. So we're going to get this error, and the reason we're getting the error is because we don't have an index function yet. We need to create one under the contacts controller.php. So we're going to create a function called index, and this is where we're going to write our logic for our index. So we'll write a try catch because, I mean, that's a good thing to do, right? Catch any errors that might occur. Exception, $error. There we go. And then what I like to do is I write it on one line, I hold down my Alt key, and I make it so that I have two cursors in 2 points, and then I hit enter, right? The error we're going to respond with is going to be the same error we're going to respond in show and search as well. So we'll write out this logic and then just quickly stub out the other two functions. So it's going to be return response, that function that we had before, a 404 error, and then we're going to have a status message in here. So status error, or whatever you want. And then we can add in our errors as well so that we can see what they are. Though I have tried this and it didn't actually work because it doesn't seem to ever get to the front, which I'm not sure why. I would have to do some tests to figure that out. So this is the basics of our functions. So what I would like you to do is copy that and then paste it into show, and also paste it into the search one as well. So you'll have 3 altogether. And then you'll need to change their names from index to show for the show one, and index to search for the other one. So you'll have 3 functions altogether with all basically the same logic, right? Index, show, and search. So once you've done that, you should be able to hit refresh and the error should go away, because now we actually have the call. And so index is the super simplest one to write, because all it is a select all records from the database and then render them to the screen. Now, what I have noticed in some of your code bases that when you guys actually just do a simple select where you control the whole statement and you're not taking any input in from the user, you still do that like prepare and bind. You actually don't need to when you're controlling the whole SQL statement. Unless you're going to SQL inject yourself, which I highly doubt you're going to do, or write data to the database that you shouldn't be writing, which I doubt you're going to do to yourself. There's no reason to go through the whole process of, what's the word I'm looking for? Filtering, sanitizing, and validation, all that wonderful stuff, right? So the easiest way to do this is we're going to write a SQL statement here, not in all capital letters. Select star from, and our database, which is contacts. Contacts, not contact. Contacts. Now to get the result, it's super easy. We call that DBO function I created in the contact.php page. And then we're going to call query. And query is just, it's like prepare in the fact that it executes. Well, prepare doesn't actually execute the query. Prepare just prepares the query to get it ready to go to MySQL, and then execute sends it. Query kind of does both at once. It prepares the statement and sends it for execution all in one go and returns back a statement. So we just query the SQL itself, and then we fetch all. So we get our result set all in one go. PDO, fetch, ASOC. So that's the format that we want it in, right? So all one statement. This, by the way, is called chaining, where we chain commands onto each other like this. It's called chaining, where we take the return value of this and chain the next command onto it. It's pretty common. And then once we have that, we return our response as a 200 with our result. If I hit refresh over here, I get all my contacts. Very, very easy. Very, very simple function call. Not too elaborate. So show is arguably harder because we can't do that in show. We definitely have to prepare. And the reason why we have to prepare in show is because we're getting information from the user, right? So we don't want to just trust it. We need to protect against it. So with show, we have a little bit of a difference in it as well, because in index, we have no parameters, But in show, we will have a parameter. We'll have the ID. And the reason why we have an ID is because the idea of show is to select one contact, not multiple contacts. If you're still writing out the function, I have pasted it into the completed version into the chat. So let's take a look at what our SQL will look like. Our SQL is pretty simple. It's basically the same as the other one, right? It starts off the same. Select star from contacts. But then we have a where clause, right? Where ID equals :ID. And the :ID is our bound parameter, right? It's the placeholder for where we're actually going to bind a value. Then we have our statement that we're going to create by calling DBO and setting our preparation on it. So prepare our SQL. Then we can go ahead and bind our parameter, right? Which we don't need to store in a variable, the result set. We just tell it which placeholder we're binding to, the value we're binding, and then the extra little piece which allows us to sanitize that data all in one go. Which is kind of nice. Instead of you having to write sanitization expressions, you can actually sanitize directly inline when you do your bind parameter. You can just instantly sanitize. Once we're done that, we can go ahead and execute. Execute, if I can spell tonight. Wow. And then we can collect our result. And that will return back. Fetch returns back a single record, whereas fetch all returns back multiple records. Now, the one thing we want to do is if we don't get a result back based on that ID, we should return something. So what we'll do is just return back an empty set of brackets, curly braces, because we can't just return an empty array. It won't work. It actually causes an error because it gets treated like an array. We don't have curly braces in JavaScript or in PHP. So we actually have to send back a string of JSON decoded so that this turns it into an object so that it gets interpreted properly in JSON. It's kind of weird, but it's necessary. Otherwise, we're going to return our response. Well, we're going to return our response regardless as a 200 with the result set. So right now, we're not going to see it in the browser. We need to actually add show and then one of these IDs. So I see 12 there. I'll use 12. Whoops, that's not the one. Got a big error there too, actually, which is kind of interesting. So I'm getting a big error. This is the message that I'm passing. This is my URL, so you guys know what I'm passing. So it looks like use of undefined constant result. So I likely, yep, sure enough, see what I did here? That's not a variable, that's a constant. Let's make it a variable. There it goes, now it's working. So just to walk you through that again, we're just selecting from the contents where the ID is equal to ID. We're preparing the SQL statement. We're binding the parameter, right? So that this is the same as this over here. It's binding this value to that parameter, and then it's intentionally sanitizing at the same time. So if this is not a number, it will cast it to a number, and then it'll just wind up being a null string. That protects you, right? That entirely protects you. Then we execute that SQL statement. Then we go ahead and fetch the record, store it in results. If the result happens to be empty, say they pass an ID that doesn't exist, we're going to decode a set of curly braces, which is an object literal in JSON world. We're going to basically encode those into an object so that PHP doesn't need to understand it, but we'll get back what we're looking for. And then we'll return our response, the 200 response. I am kind of curious. Ooh, no, I already know what that looks like. Never mind. Doesn't matter. All right. Our last one is our search term. So this is a little different. It's going to take a parameter. It's going to have a parameter and take an argument, right? Called term. Now in the last class, they got me to break this apart and actually show them how to do multiple fields by spacing. Like if you passed in a term with spaces, you break it apart. We're not going to do that just because it's quite intense. And it didn't quite work properly anyways, so it doesn't matter. I would need more time to figure it out and actually set it up. So this one, we're going to take our term, and no, we're not going to sanitize it, pre-sanitize. There's no reason to. We're going to take our SQL. That's what we're going to do. Select star from contacts where, and I looked at some of the search labs that people did in the second group, and a lot of them are doing this weird concatenation with like. So they would like create a concatenated statement and then pass it to it just so they could get the percent signs in it. What's cool though is that SQL already has stuff like that built in to make things easy. So you can do fname like concat, like so, right? And then you just give it a list of things you want to concatenate together, separated by commas. So I can give percent sign, comma, term, so my bound parameter, comma, percent sign. See? So now I'm still using bound parameters, but it's in a nice convenient way. And then I can use an OR statement and do another concat. And then it's literally the same statement. It's just percent signs, comma term, and then percent signs. Just don't use double quotes because it won't work, right? Because you have a double quote here. You'd have to escape them all. But super simple, nice and easy. I'll copy and paste that for you. Right? And this way I can also search whatever term you give me across the first name and last name columns, right? If I wanted to take a full name and search it across the columns, I would have to split it apart somehow. So now I'm going to do $statement equals DBO prepare $SQL. I mean, all of this is literally the same as above. Bind the param. So the term to the variable to the sanitization. PDO param string. Yes, I do want lname in my query. That is correct. Or lname like concat. Thank you for that catch. I totally missed that. You are right. Let me repaste that. Good catch, Andrew. Alright, and then, oh, execute. That's what we need to do next. Execute. And then we can go ahead and get our result, which will be $statement. And it's a fetch all because we're taking back all of the, we're getting a collection of records that match our terms, right? And then same scenario again. If the result happens to be negative, then we'll just assign an empty array to the result. By the way, this is an inline if statement. I just realized I was writing them without telling you what they are. This statement, you can put curly braces around this. That totally is okay. However, you don't need to because it's just one expression. So you can literally just go if result equals square braces. That's funny. I didn't tell the other class either, and nobody asked. So, I don't know. Maybe you guys already knew that? That's the only problem with, like, professors. Like, well, I don't consider myself a professor. The only reason being is because professor is actually is an educational term given to somebody who is published and has a PhD. So I don't have a PhD, and the only publishing I have is crap I've written that nobody reads. So I'm not exactly published in any way. So I consider myself as an instructor. And I think, to be fair, all Georgian college teachers, unless they're the only one I can think of that has a PhD and might be published, would be Andrew. She's the only one I can think of off the top of my head. Otherwise, nobody's published. So that professor status, it kind of ticks people off who are professors. They get kind of annoyed about that. I had a professor at UOIT named Mike, and he had a PhD in business, and he was published, and he went on like a 30-minute rant about it, about how it annoyed him and made him agitated and everything else. So since then, I've been like, I get kind of nervous about when people are like, Professor McKinnon. It's not. Like, I'm not, because I'm not published. And I prefer to be called Sean. I'm just not a fan of Mr. McKinnon or anything like that. I mean, I'm 42. I'm not 80. All right, let's rant taken. It wasn't directed at you, Andrew, by any means whatsoever. It's actually, I get called Professor McKinnon all the time, constantly. And I mean, it's nice. It's a nice thing to be called, but in reality, I'm not, right? It's like calling somebody a doctor who's not actually a doctor, that kind of thing. Yeah, I would actually say it's that same stature, too. Yeah. Okay, so if I refresh, this isn't going to do squat. We need to do the actual search. So we're going to change show to search, and then just type in a couple of letters or something. So I'll copy my actual thing for you. There you go. And so that's searching against first names and last names. And just to prove that, if I change this to McKinnon, because I have McKinnon in here, and hit enter, you see it loads it, right? I have McKinnon. But if I also search just Sean by itself, it loads it as well. So I get both. So now if everything is golden, the client should load, in theory, without crashes. Hold on, I want to... There we go. So yeah, I've got my table loading over here and everything else loading. Let's just make sure create works, because I found that it glitches sometimes and it doesn't work properly. So why don't we create a new person, David Bowie. I mean, he's dead, but what was he, almost 80 when he died? And we'll just do Stardust dot Major Tom at starchild.com. I mean, that's enough references, right? Personal page, Bowie rocks. Oh, we need HTTP in there though, or HTTPS. BowieRocks.com, and then click create. Okay, so that's actually going to send a request. It sends the request off to our a post request. Actually, it sends a post request off to our what's that thing that we built? Our API, and our API will respond. So we did get a response of create failed to open stream. Lovely. We got a 404 response from the endpoint. That's why. So we shouldn't have gotten a 404. Oh, no. We should not have gotten a 404 either way. So that's saying that happened on line 56 of our application. So if I go to our client and the index page and look at line 56. By the way, you can easily get to a line by hitting Control G and typing in the number. So there's our endpoint, there's our action. I mean, this is all correct. I don't see a problem with that API endpoint. I'm guessing that an error occurred on the other end. We could try refreshing. Sometimes it doesn't work the first time and then works every time thereafter. So let me just try ASDFs. Maybe it was something I had typed in that I didn't like. Oops. Actually, we can actually leave the age empty. There we go, and create. Okay. Yeah, so it's something in the data that I think was wrong, which is interesting because I've had this happen before and I'm not entirely sure what's in the data that it keeps blowing up on. I wonder if it's the dot syntax I was doing before. Because I bet you that's it. I bet you it's whatever I'm typing in this form, something is causing it to blow up on the other end. No, it worked that time. I don't know. Maybe it's just the first time it didn't work. Yeah, it could have been the dot in the email, but I just tried it in the second one and it worked. So anyways, to update, in case you want to update a field, you just click the little thing, right? And it will load this form. And the way it's doing it, it's reaching out to the endpoint, requesting the show page, right? The show action. And then the show action returns and we populate the form. And then you can change it, right? Like so. Hit update. And that will actually force the update record to go through. And then we should get one of these updated. I'm kind of surprised it didn't. Oh yeah, there it is. George Humphrey. See, it's been updated entirely. If you want to delete them, it's kind of a janky process. You click delete. It loads the form. You click delete. You click OK. That removes that record after a few seconds once it goes through our system. And then it removes the record. The funny thing is, the delay that you're experiencing here isn't even our API. Our API is actually communicating super, super fast. The problem is the Chuck Norris API. The Chuck Norris API, for some reason, is super slow. So when we click delete, it's not the idea of the delete and the response. It's the delete, the response, and then the reach out to the Chuck Norris API and the return of that. We have to wait for all that to complete in order for this to finish. That's the problem. So that's cool. So we have all of this, but you might be like, okay, Sean, you know what? Whatever. This is a PHP website. This is a PHP API. What's the difference? It doesn't really make a big difference. I mean, they're both PHP. They're both existing on your local host server. What proof is there here? Like, what proof do we have that this is actually, you know, not just a PHP thing? Well, I'll show you what the proof is. We are going to copy this, and I am going to go to something called Hopscotch. So Hopscotch.io exists here. I currently have it registered. Do I have it registered? I tried to do this earlier and it wouldn't register. Hold on, maybe I'm jumping the gun here. Yeah, it's not going to register. It's going to be a twit. Instead, we'll use Postman. Either way, so this is a server that basically works. This is an application that basically works by creating an HTTP request for you to an endpoint. This was kind of one of those things that Jess was talking about where she said, you know, there's a problem with client-side validation because it can be entirely bypassed by using something like Postman, right? Because Postman allows you to be able to create post requests without ever touching a browser or using a form or anything like that. So I'm going to come into here. Oh, right here, sorry. I'm going to come into here and paste my search and change this to a GET request. And this is Postman, right? So we're not doing this through the browser. I'm going to click send, and as you can see, it returned back my information for me, right? So now I have all my information. So here's my search request. If I change that to ASDF, I think I get a few more records. No, I get no records. What about Bowie? Yep, there's my David Bowie one, right? So I get that information. If I wanted to create one, I can create a post request to contacts. I can go to this body and actually fill out the body itself with this data. I've already pre-filled it, right? But I can fill it out with the data, click send, and that creates a new record in the database. So I think it worked. I don't know if it actually worked. I'm starting to think that the create does not... Oh, right, because I didn't pass create. I need the word create at the end. Sorry. There we go. So I get back a return message saying that we created it successfully. That's awesome. And then I can go ahead and add my GET request and see now that I have another field in here, right? So I've got two Seans in here now. And if I was to do a search for Sean, I would get back my two records, right? So we've built essentially a very simple API. There's nothing too elaborate about our API. Has a very simple routing system, has controllers for handling the actual logic and stuff. If we were to build a proper RESTful API, we would have likely models there as well for dealing with those resources, and we may even have views in order to format our JSON responses into a particular format. Can I show the search function for a second? There you go. So like I said, no quiz, no lab tonight. I will be finishing all the phase 3 marking and lab markings on the weekend. Once they're marked and done, that's it. Yeah. So it's kind of good, actually, because it gives me time to actually complete all your marks that were left over. Just to give you a heads up, there's about 130 things to mark. So I will try to complete them all on the weekend. You will notice that I don't give a ton of feedback. If your application works, I tend to not give very much feedback at all. But if your application is broken, I will usually tell you what's wrong, unless I encounter the fatal, I've pasted code, why doesn't it work? When I hit that, I tend to just bypass it and then write a comment about your coding practice. I'm a big believer, and I kind of follow this. Code with intent. What I mean by that statement, code with intent, is that if you don't understand the code that you're copying and pasting, then you shouldn't be writing it, right? You need to understand it, so you need to look it up and figure out, how does this thing actually work? What is it that I'm actually putting on the page? So if you don't understand what it does, don't use it, okay? Only use code you understand. And I realize you may be like, well, then I'll be writing 3 lines of code. That's better than writing 200 lines of code that don't work, right? So, and that can be embarrassing as well, especially when I find, because I call it out, when I find that you're using a function or a variable that you haven't previously declared, and all of a sudden you're referencing it, I'll call you out on it, especially when you're in semester 2, and you've gone through all of those steps of learning introduction to programming. I kind of expect you to understand how variables and referencing works. So when I see those kind of things, I call you out on it, because it can be indicative sometimes that maybe programming is not the path for you, right? So that's definitely something to look at. Implement the REST? No, God, no. Not at all, Andrew. Now, if you do implement the REST API in your project, I could definitely seek bonus marks in your future. This was just me fulfilling Jess's requirement of teaching APIs. Would I please help you in the index PHP of client? I'm assuming you need to share your screen, Harmon? Oh. That's crazy. I didn't know it could just hijack like that. Go ahead, client. Yeah, scroll to the top, please. Might as well start with the first one. So the address information that you're using on line 7 of your index.php page in the client. So in your IDE, go to client index.php. Let's see here. So lesson files, examples, API examples / API. Is that the actual URL? Do we know for a fact that's the URL? I think it is, right? So line 7. Base endpoints / contacts. That's correct. So go back to your browser for a second. Okay, so yeah, something's weird here, because you've got a weird address here. That is not the same address. Can you go to your API that we've been working in the browser? Go to the API in the browser. Yeah, that's why. Your API URL is wrong. So click up there in the address bar. Copy that. Go to your IDE. Replace that address on line 4 with what you just copied. Remove that trailing slash at the end, though. Yeah, save that. Now go back to your client and reload. Perfect. So now we're only getting some errors. So trying to get a property value of non-object on line 90. So go to your IDE. Go to Htaccess and the controller.php file for Htaccess. That's correct. And your response is correct. Interesting. Go to your index.php for API. Oh, right there. Line 10. Uncomment that. And it's not JSON like the name, it's JSON. So J-S-O-N. So remove the A. There you go. Save that. On line 27, remove that var dump because it will cause a problem. Because it will actually wind up outputting and then that will cause an error. Which is kind of annoying, but that's just what happens. Let's scroll down. Let's just make sure there's nothing else. Scroll down a bit. Your array slice. Stop. Stop, stop, stop. Line 37 should be on the same line as 36. There you go. Save that. Scroll down some more. Okay, so require once resource controller.php. That's correct. Down a little further. You see line 57. Stop, 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 stop. See lines 57 to 59. Copy those. And then between case delete and the break statement, paste that.
After this break?
No, before the break. Just before the break. Yeah, right there. There you go. Change from get, though. You see where it says get on line 62? Change that to post. Oh, wait. Why did you cut it? I wanted you to copy it, not cut it. You need it in both spots. Yeah, there you go. Now on line 65, change that to post. There you go. And scroll down a little bit more just to make sure we're not missing anything. Cool, that's awesome. So let's go over to the client and refresh. Everything's working. Yep, totally working.
Thank you.
No problem. Alright, so as I was saying, that's all I have for tonight. If there's anything else you need, please let me know.